weeks ago, President Obama welcomed China's Xi Jinping to the United States for his first state visit as president. It was an opportunity for the administration to make inroads with Mr. Xi on concerns of areas of mutual interest, as well as to address areas of serious concern. I joined my ranking members of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the House at large wrote President Obama a letter urging direct communication on a few especially troubling issues. As we review the state visit with our distinguished panel, I hope to learn more about how receptive the administration was to these concerns and what challenges outside of these major obstacles remain. Since President Xi's ascension, China's newfound assertiveness has generated some distressing policy developments. For instance, over the years, China's cyber economic espionage has become a significant irritant in U.S.-China relations. It was clear that progress on cybersecurity relations was a priority for our administration, and we are supportive that both countries agreed neither country's government will conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property to benefit their economies. This agreement is a positive and necessary step, but it's not sufficient. China still refuses to acknowledge its role in these attacks, despite evidence that clearly points to the contrary. It is my hope that our administration holds guilty actors accountable through punitive actions such as cyber sanctions, takes steps to deter future incidents of malicious cyber espionage, and improves our own cyber defense against these kinds of threats. Congress, too, will be watching this very closely. In the months leading up to the visit, the business community expressed serious concerns about China's growing protectionism. China's national security reforms, some of which have already been codified into law, could force U.S. businesses and institutions out of China's market through forced technology transfers, while other provisions would block both trade associations and humanitarian NGOs on national security grounds. President Xi has promised to use the review only for bona fide security reasons, but China defines national security much more broadly than the U.S. does, and the process itself is fundamentally opaque, creating serious risk for abuse and few avenues to appeal harmful actions by the Chinese government. Increased state intervention in the recent stock market troubles and currency exchange rates also breaches China's commitments to let market forces play a decisive role in its economy. China's aggression in the South China Sea has been a long-standing concern for this subcommittee, one which is shared throughout the government and civil society. I appreciate that the administration continues to raise the issue with their Chinese counterparts, but President Xi's position on China's illegal maritime claims did not budge during the visit. President Xi mentioned that China does not intend to pursue militarization, and I know we will hold him accountable for this. There was no noticeable progress on worsening human rights conditions in China. President Xi noted that countries have different historical processes and realities to justify its poor record on human rights. That's not an excuse, and I'll work to ensure that human rights play a larger role in foreign policy decisions. I understand what China's doing here. China, benefiting from decades of central planning geared towards economic growth, is slowing down. Laden with increasing demands from a new middle class, the country is at risk of political, economic, and even military unrest. China is trying to divert crisis through assertive domestic and foreign policies, but often the actions that we see are not reflective of a responsible international player, if that's what China wants to be. The visit also yielded pledges that the U.S. and China would boost cooperation on various multilateral issues, including nuclear security, wildlife trafficking and conservation, which are welcome developments. I'm concerned about the climate deal, however, which signs U.S. businesses up to strictly adhere to environmental standards, while China is not obligated to implement any reforms at all until 2030. Encouraging the use of responsible and clean energy technology is understandable and laudable, but I remain concerned and frustrated that the Obama administration continues to use climate politics to put U.S. businesses at a competitive disadvantage and impose burdensome costs on U.S. families, all in the hopes that 15 years from now, China will live up to a non-binding agreement they make today. I hope to hear from our distinguished panel about their impressions of the visit and what it portends for the future on our bilateral relationship. I support China's integration with the international community. China has a lot to offer, and their leadership on a number of quarrelsome issues facing the global community, like an unstable and belligerent North Korea, is welcome. I hope that our government continues to engage China, but also holds it accountable to being the responsible actor it portrays itself to be. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record, and without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length of limitation in the rules. And I now yield to Ms. Meng, the ranking member here today, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Salmon, and thank you to our distinguished panel of witnesses for being here today. President Xi's recent visit came at an important yet tense time for our two countries. U.S.-China ties have long been complex, but as the world's two most powerful economies, it is essential that our countries work together and cooperate in areas on which we agree. While there were very few areas of new cooperation, the administration was able to expand and highlight existing cooperation in climate change, reining in North Korea's nuclear programs, and military confidence building. However, foremost in our minds is the new promise of cooperation in cybersecurity and on intellectual property. I know that my colleagues and I are interested to see if these new developments will lead to positive changes, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts today. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Perry, did you have an opening statement? I'll introduce the panel. First of all, Mr. Chen Guangcheng, known to many as the Barefoot Lawyer, is the founder of the Chen Guangcheng Foundation and a visiting fellow at Catholic University. Welcome, Mr. Chen. Dr. Jessica Chen Weiss is a professor of government at Cornell University. Welcome. Mr. Richard Baitlick is Chief Security Strategist at FireEye and previously was Chief Security Officer at Mandiant. And Dr. Scott Kennedy joins us from CSIS, where he is Deputy Director of the Freedom Chair in China Studies and Director of the Project on Chinese Business and Political Economy. And I'm going to start with you, Mr. Chen, and we're just thrilled that you could be here today.
人权是与每一个人都息息相关的，在中美两国的关系中，也理应是核心议题。
Human rights matter to everybody and should therefore be a core issue in U.S.-China relations.
最近习近平的访美关心的人们都会想，中国恶劣的人权状况在习奥会中的地位。
And during Mr. Xi Jinping's visit here, everybody should concern about the human rights issues on the agenda during his meeting with Mr. President Obama.
中共对人权捍卫者、人权律师、民主人士 宗教人士、上访者等的迫害不仅从未停止，而且越发的严重。
The ongoing crackdown on human rights defenders, human rights lawyers, and democracy activists and religious freedom activists, and it's getting worse.
自7月9日至今，这个受害者就超过300人。
And victim of such a crackdown since July the 9th is amounted to 300.
暴力继升仍在继续，强拆民房、强占土地、威胁、骚扰、抓捕、关押、仗义执言者的事情不断发生。
And such brutal things as forced abortion, forced demolition, and land grabbing, threatening harassment on those human rights activists and those who speak up their mind is still going on.
甚至在解访的过程中，公然枪杀访民。
And a tragedy happened that during the petition, some petitioners were killed.
就在上月，政府为了逼迁，竟把山东平邑县的房主张继民活活烧死在自家房内。
And it was just last month that happened to a landowner burned alive in his own home during the forced abortion by the local government in Pingyi County, Shandong Province.
美国是全世界人权盟主、民主模范和自由的象征。
The United States is the global leader in human rights defenders and democracy model and icon of freedom.
因而，捍卫普世价值应变成美国重要的国际责任。
Defending universal human rights should be a very important part of the international responsibility for the United States.
这次习的访美，当然我们不知道奥巴马总统到底提出了多少实际的人权问题。
We are still not sure how much that President Obama has talked about human rights during his meeting with Mr. Xi Jinping.
是从真心关心人权的角度，还是作为一种工作而已？
Did the president talk about human rights issues as a individual person who really care about human rights, or it's just a part of his job?
但我们看到的是，习访问白宫时，奥巴马用白布拉起屏障来确保习看不到抗议者。
But what we saw actually during Mr. Xi Jinping's visit to the White House, that the president used a kind of white curtain to block the view of those protesters outside the house.
鉴于很多国家多年来已经乐见中共不顾自己人民的死活而向世界撒钱的做法，为了眼前的利益而无视中国的人权状况，我建议
It's sad to see that so many countries who, just care about the money that from the communist regime, who doesn't really care about the living standard of his own people, and for the short term, and they just ignore the deteriorating human rights conditions in China. So for that, I would recommend the following.
一，美国总统、国会议员要不断公开谈论人权问题，通过媒体的深入报道，让人民了解中国的人权状况，也让独裁政权知道美国是真正关心人权。
And therefore, the United States President, Congress people, and all those who should talk human rights issues openly and through media coverage, and to let people know what's exactly the human rights conditions are, and also therefore to let the world know that the United States really care about human rights.
二，要求中共释放所有的良心犯，像高志胜、许志勇、刘平、李和平、 高瑜等仍被关押软禁是不可容忍的。
We demand the communist regime to release those prisoners of conscience like Mr. Gao Zhishan, Xu Zhiyong, Mr. Liu Ping, and Ms. Li Heping, and Madam Gao Yu, who are still in custody. And under housing arrest is definitely not allowed.
3. 立法禁止人权迫害者入境美国并冻结他们在美的资产。
And third, there should be a special law to deny the interests of those Chinese officials who are violators of human rights, and also fortify their personal wealth in the United States.
4. 协助开发打破网络柏林墙的软件，组建民主国际组织。
And number 4, that assistant to develop the cyber software to break down the cyber burning wall in order to build a democratic alliance in international community.
谢谢大家。
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chun. Dr. Weiss.
谢谢。
Chairman Salmon and distinguished members of the subcommittee, it's a pleasure and a privilege to share with you today my thoughts on Xi Jinping's recent visit and my assessment of U.S.-China relations going forward. In my view, President Xi's visit produced modest but measurable progress in managing the growing frictions in our relationship with China. The large number of business and industry leaders who participated underscores the continued importance of our economic relationship. President Xi's speeches reflected his recognition of American concerns, particularly among the business community. The joint agreement to refrain from cyber theft marked an important step forward. It remains to be seen whether words will be followed by actions, as President Obama put it, but the pledge means that Chinese agencies can be held to account, for President Xi's international credibility here is on the line. President Xi also used the weight of his words to reiterate China's commitment to a market-based exchange rate and to curb greenhouse gases through a cap-and-trade system. No doubt, implementing these priorities will be fraught with challenges, but the direction underscores China's desire to address international concerns in line with continued domestic reforms. The visit also produced progress in the area of the relationship that could lead to unwanted military escalation. The annex on air-to-air encounters adds an important component to the Memorandum of Understanding on the rules of military engagement. The Chinese government recognizes that an incident in the air could derail the relationship, given the strong patriotism and mutual suspicion on both sides. A repeat of the 2001 collision between a Chinese fighter jet and U.S. EP-3 reconnaissance plane could easily escalate and take on outsized significance in the public imagination. In 2001, the Chinese government managed to mourn the Chinese pilot while repressing anti-American street demonstrations. But today, China under Xi Jinping may not be willing or able to show similar restraint, given the dramatic improvement in Chinese capabilities and the exponential growth of the internet and social media in China. The Chinese government may have the ability to shut down conversation online, but it is increasingly costly for the government to do so, particularly when it is patriotism that the government is repressing. During his visit, President Xi also stated for the first time that China does not intend to militarize or pursue militarization of reclaimed islands and features in the South China Sea, and committed to upholding and respecting the freedom of navigation. As with his commitment to fight cybercrime, President Xi's remarks provide welcome reassurances, and we should continue to engage China to define what constitutes militarization. Over the past 3 years, China has kept a lid on many of the domestic pressures that might provoke or complicated a potential crisis. China has streamlined its maritime patrols under a consolidated and more professionalized Coast Guard, and under President Xi, China has also largely restrained nationalist mobilization, preventing grassroots protest against, say, Prime Minister Abe's visit to Yasukuni Shrine in 2013, as well as his efforts to revise and reinterpret the Japanese Constitution. Chinese authorities also stymied protests against Vietnam after Vietnamese anger spilled over into riots that killed Chinese workers. At the same time, Chinese activities have effectively changed the status quo in the East and South China Seas, ending Japan's exclusive control of islands in the East China Sea and outpacing rival efforts to reclaim land and build infrastructure in the South China Sea. In response, some today are calling for a more muscular American approach. While not intended to ignite conflict, we must recognize that such measures are intrinsically risky, particularly if these operations involve highly public denials of Chinese claims. As such, we must determine in advance how far we are willing to go, or we might otherwise find ourselves in a contest where our actions are driven more by concern for American credibility than our underlying interests. Chinese restraint and adherence to international legal principles will be critical to lowering the temperature in the region, and we should link progress on this front to corresponding and conditional U.S. assurances. Threats to impose costs on China for undesirable behavior must at the same time be coupled with credible reassurances that the United States welcomes China's contribution to global governance and multilateral leadership. As noted in the joint statements, the United States welcomes China's playing a more active role in and taking on due responsibility for the international financial architecture. In conclusion, how we talk about China matters as much as how we act toward China. Whether or not China is the intended audience, Chinese observers are listening to the tone as well as to the words we speak. Some campaign statements may be taken with a hefty dose of salt, but others will be regarded as credible indicators of future policy. U.S. pressure on China can be effective if it strengthens the hand of those inside China who are trying to push policy in the same direction for their own domestic reasons. But any U.S. policy or strategy based solely on beating China or peaceful evolution is bound to be guarded with suspicion at best and hostility at worst. Thinly veiled or outright opposition to a stable and prosperous China will harm the ability of those inside China who advocate for international cooperation. If the United States abandons engagement, nationalists and conservatives in China will be vindicated in their belief that the United States seeks to keep China weak and divided. In sum, the future is not written, and acting as if conflict is preordained will only create a self-fulfilling prophecy. To manage our differences and build upon the modest but measurable progress we have already made requires the hard work of tough, sustained engagement rather than the fiery posturing that it is all too easy for voices on both sides to indulge. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey.
Chairman Salmon, Congresswoman Meng, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I am Richard Baitlick, Chief Security Strategist at FireEye. I'm also pursuing a PhD in War Studies from King's College London, and I began my security career as a military intelligence officer in 1997 at the Air Force Information Warfare Center. Has President Obama secured relief from Chinese hacking? On balance, the agreement is a step in the right direction. At best, I would expect it to result in a decrease in the digital intrusion pressure applied by Chinese military and intelligence forces against American companies. The Chinese would likely continue pursuing their strategic goals by changing tactics at the human level and operations at the merger and acquisition level. At worst, I expect the agreement to have no effect whatsoever. Let me briefly offer 5 issues for your consideration. First, consider President Xi's posture prior to the December 25th press conference. In written answers to questions posed by the Wall Street Journal, President Xi claimed, quote, "The Chinese government does not engage in theft of commercial secrets in any form, nor does it encourage or support Chinese companies to engage in such practices in any way." Combining this statement with his later declarations, it is possible that President Xi is saying that the Chinese government does not hack because he doesn't consider the People's Liberation Army, Ministry of State Security, or other organizations conducting hacking operations to be part of his definition of Chinese government. Therefore, PLA units such as 61398, revealed by my Mandiant colleagues in 2013, will continue to raid American companies because President Xi does not count them as government forces. A second interpretation could be congruent with both U.S. and Chinese interests. The U.S. targets Chinese organizations, as well as others worldwide, to conduct economic espionage. Such economic espionage is designed to better understand foreign financial conditions and uncover bribery and corruption that harms American businesses. The U.S. has a long-standing policy of not passing what it learns from these spying missions to American companies for competitive gain. It's possible the U.S. administration believes its Chinese counterpart will now act in a reciprocal manner. American companies will still be targeted by Chinese hacking teams, but the Chinese government will claim that it is working to collect economic data and uncover bribery and corruption. Whether the Chinese government passes what it learns to Chinese companies for economic advantage remains an open question. A third interpretation could signal a tactical shift in Chinese commercial data acquisition. China has never been a one-trick pony when it comes to stealing business information. The Chinese conduct extensive and aggressive cyber operations, but they also employ equally comprehensive human campaigns as well. The Chinese may have decided to simply shift resources towards the physical collection of commercial data and wind down their cyber operations. A fourth interpretation could signal an operational shift in Chinese commercial data acquisition. President Xi's words, combined with his meeting with American business leaders in Seattle, could mean that he wants to conduct more merger and acquisition activity, and he expects the Obama administration to permit it. Currently sensitive technology deals, such as the rumored $23 billion bid by China's Tsinghua Unigroup Ltd. For chipmaker Micron, are likely to be blocked by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS. While some deals, such as the 2014 acquisition of IBM's low-end server business, have cleared CFIUS approval, others remain problematic. Xi's mention of many of his government's strategic emerging industries when talking to President Obama indicates to me that these remain a strategic priority, as shown by Baidu's investment in and joint venture with American content delivery network company Cloudflare. China will use traditional business methods to acquire intellectual property, market share, and service know-how in order to advance its strategic goals. A final consideration for this agreement is who is left out. The focus on US and Chinese companies ignores many other targets. These include civil society organizations, as well documented in the recent report by the University of Toronto's Citizen Lab titled Communities at Risk. These civil society organizations include dissident groups inside and outside China, universities, think tanks, media organizations, lawyers like Mr. Chen, and human rights watchers. Companies in other parts of the world are not covered by the US-China agreement. And honestly, I'm surprised we haven't seen the Brits or Germans going to China and saying, hey, we want the same agreement to cover us as well. Those organizations continue to be held at risk. So in conclusion, the Xi visit produced more positive statements than I expected, but now we must see if words are followed by decreased malicious activity in cyberspace. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy.
Chairman Salmon, members of the committee, I'm honored by the opportunity to testify before you today and present my thoughts on the Chinese economy and U.S.-China commercial relations in the context of the recent state visit. The main point I want to convey today is one of caution. In broad historical terms, China's economy is much more market-oriented than it was 30, 20, or even 10 years ago, and the United States, business and consumers and workers have largely benefited from the commercial relationship and China's growing role in the global economy. However, over the past few years, the pace of liberalization in China has slowed, and in some ways the state is expanding its intervention in the economy in ways that parallel developments in human rights and the internet that have already been discussed. At the same time, China's economy is slowing. It's becoming much more volatile. As a result, doing business with China is more challenging, and the slowdown and volatility we see in China are creating new challenges and risks for foreign businesses and other economies. Ongoing efforts to engage China bilaterally and multilaterally, as well as adoption of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, are addressing many of these problems, but we should expect continued commercial frictions in the coming years. You have my full written statement. Let me briefly elaborate on this conclusion. There is broad consensus that the Chinese economy is slowing dramatically. There is no consensus as to exactly how much, why, or what the future trajectory of growth is. My own view is that growth is somewhere below the official figure of around 7%, but that China is not in a recession. Continued growth in services, consumption, and wages distinguish the current period from 2008 and 2009, when China did fall into a recession. The current slowdown is in part the product of a government-induced contraction brought about by much tighter credit conditions and a vast anti-corruption campaign that has made officials throughout the system far more hesitant to approve projects. Now, Xi Jinping came into power promising a much more aggressive reform agenda than his predecessor, Hu Jintao. And over the past 2 to 3 years, there have been a series of individual reform policies announced and implemented, but they haven't been all embracing or comprehensive. And within the last 18 months, the trend has decidedly been in a statist direction. The government has chosen monetary and fiscal stimulus over liberalization in an effort to get the economy moving. It pushed up the stock market in 2014, and this past summer famously and unsuccessfully intervened to keep this bubble it created from bursting. The reform package for state-owned enterprises, announced several weeks ago, is anything but reformist. And China's forthcoming 5-year plan, yes, China still has 5-year plans, looks like it will include only incremental reforms to the economy and the country's governance institutions. It's no surprise, then, that U.S.-China economic ties are under some significant stress. Commercial relations over the past 36 years have broadly benefited the American economy, our businesses, consumers, and even, on balance, workers. But American companies that do business in China and with China are understandably worried about the slowing pace of liberalization, the continued use of industrial policies to promote domestic firms, and the opacity of China's policy process. Even in services, which are much less politically sensitive than high technology, the Chinese are not embracing liberalization despite the fact that there would be immediate benefits to economic growth and to the broader public if they opened up services in healthcare, education, and elsewhere. The most important emerging issue is the potential negative effect that China's economic volatility and slowdown can have on the global economy. China's economy is now so large and financial flows so substantial that developments in its economy ripple throughout the rest of the world very quickly. And as China's capital markets open, the ripple effect could become a tidal wave traveling at the speed of light. We saw this occur in July in the wake of China's intervention in the stock market, and in August following the revision of how the renminbi's rate is set. Now, there was some progress on these issues during the recent state visit. President Xi did repeatedly reaffirm the importance of continued economic reform and keeping the country's doors open to foreign businesses. And he reaffirmed the importance of the Bretton Woods institutions and pledged collaboration between the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which China helped create, and the World Bank and other multilateral development institutions. But despite these commitments, it's appropriate to remain cautious about whether American companies will achieve greater access to the Chinese market or be treated more fairly going forward. In addition, I wasn't convinced that President Xi fully appreciates the need to provide greater transparency about the economy and their economic policies. At the press conference that he had with President Obama on Friday, the 25th, President Xi did try to reassure markets by saying there's no reason for the renminbi to depreciate over the long run. I think there's a good debate to be had on that statement, but even given that, this leaves unresolved whether the government may permit a devaluation of the RMB in the short term to support growth or stem capital outflows. The U.S. and China announced that their negotiators have made incremental progress on a bilateral investment treaty, but I don't expect a U.S.-China BIT to be submitted to Congress anytime soon. China is focused on its anti-corruption campaign and avoiding economic instability, while the number one economic policy priority toward the region for the United States is passage of TPP. It seems highly unlikely the U.S. will seek to conclude a BIT, let alone submit it to Congress prior to passage and adoption of TPP. Finally, let me say something more about TPP. As you know, China is not a negotiating party, though it has expressed interest in potentially joining. It is possible China will react to Monday's announcement by expanding its own regional arrangements, but being outside TPP would put Chinese companies at a competitive disadvantage in those sectors it needs to move into to have sustainable growth over the long term, including high technologies and advanced services. The U.S. would be wise to use TPP not as a tool just to compete with China, but as a lever to help induce greater economic reforms in China, which would not only be in China's self-interest, but would also benefit American companies, workers, and consumers, and likely contribute to reducing China's carbon emissions and cleaning up its environment. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll begin with questions, and then Mr. Rohrbacher, I'll turn to you, and maybe we can have a couple of rounds of questions. Does that sound good to you? Mr. Chun, I'd like to start with you. Back in the 90s, when we were debating whether or not to grant China permanent normal trade relations and end the Jackson-Vanik debate every year, I believed at that time that by more constructively engaging economically with China and having a stronger U.S. presence in China, that someday some of the things that vexed us the most would change, namely human rights, that they would get better, and that things like intellectual property rights would, if they were accepted into the WTO, would get better. I've been wrong. In fact, most of those things have never materialized. In fact, the human rights situation, it appears to me, while there have been times when I thought it was getting better, it seems to me that under this current president, China's taken a big step backward. I believe Deng Xiaoping had a vision of economic openness, but I think that maybe even he believed that it would yield more personal freedoms as well. It doesn't seem to be happening. First, can you tell me what are the most egregious affronts to human rights that are happening in China right now, and what can we do to be more of a positive influence to get changes in those areas? Also, would you agree that with President Xi Jinping, this president, that human rights situation has actually gotten worse?
我觉得呢，中国实际上那个时候给了这个大家有一种说法，就是中国经济发展了，那么就会民主化。我觉得实际上我们看到这个说法在中国并没有实现，相反，这种美国的很多企业到中国去做生意呢，结果把中共的那些坏毛病学到手里了。
Well, during those days of debate, that people believe that economic integration or opening to China will help improve eventually the human rights conditions there. But actually, we see the fact that during those years that American and doing business in China and those business and they learned those bad things from the communist regime there actually.
所以呢，我觉得实际上中国真正这种官民力量发生对比的变化，恰恰是当互联网的发展，以及当美国很多民间机构开发出这个破网软件以后，真正让中国很多侵犯人权的案例能够公布于世。
What I saw the game change is when we have a kind of software that could break down China's the cyber war, the firewall, and then there are some cases of human rights violation in China has been exposed to the outside world.
Dr. Kennedy, I'd like to talk to you just a little bit about China's economy, the stock market. You addressed a lot of the issues in your opening statement. On August 24th, 2015, the Shanghai stock market index fell 8.49%, followed by 7% on the following day. At that time, the Chinese government took really controversial measures to try to minimize the damage. During his visit, President Xi defended his response to the stock market crash as needed to prevent mass panic. Some analysts predict additional China stock market falls in the future. Is their economy slowing faster than analysts predicted? I know that you said in your opening statement that 7% is probably robust, probably a little optimistic, but is it slowing faster than analysts predicted? And do you think that China will continue to manipulate their stock market? And do you think that's a good idea for China's economy? Does it really stop panic, or does it actually stop future investment? And then finally, what cost does the market manipulation impose on U.S. and global markets?
It's a terrific question. I think that growth has slowed more than people expected it would because they didn't realize how significant the anti-corruption campaign would have on growth. That's the biggest contractionary policy in China today. And it's more important than just simply having less credit into the system. Actually, this is much more important overall. And in fact, if they announced an end to the anti-corruption campaign today, investment would pick up tomorrow. So it's not the weight of debt. It's really this politically induced contraction because they feel that's the way to restructure their economy. Beside that, because they cracked down on investment in real estate, all that money flooded into the stock market. So the problem with the intervention isn't July, it's June 2014, and since what we saw was just the most obvious because it was about stemming the collapse and the popping of the bubble. When President Xi was here and in his statement in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere talked about the systemic risk, it's the first time they ever mentioned systemic risk as a justification for intervention. China's stock market only accounts for about 5% of total financing in China. The Chinese stock market could disappear and China would still have the same financial system essentially. So I think that's really a post hoc justification for an addiction to intervention, that because state-owned companies were losing money and people were worried about, the Chinese government was worried about their reputational hit that they would take by so many folks losing money, even though all they lost was the run-up in the year before. The intervention that they had was poorly timed, executed, and has resulted in a loss of confidence from investors, domestic Chinese investors and foreign investors, combined with the bungled adjustment of the renminbi's setting and the depreciation. There's great concerns going forward. When you're managing the economy that's primarily a real economy, where you've got investments made over months and years, investors will move much more slowly. But now that you're talking about securities markets and a somewhat open capital account, this loss of confidence actually can change the direction of the economy in seconds just simply by us pushing a button, by selling renminbi or whatever. And that volatility will affect us more and more. So the most disappointment I had from his visit, maybe the president talked about this with President Obama privately, is they didn't explain really what that systemic risk supposedly was and why the way they decided to intervene was the best way. And they didn't restore confidence among the investment community at all. So I still think they're in a much worse position than they were several months ago.
Thanks. Mr. Rohrbacher.
Well, a couple of points that sometimes impacts of these type of visits are not measurable in terms of the economy or in terms of events that happen within a small, short framework after the visit. I would suggest that if we say this visit maybe at best had, at worst had no impact. The worst is having it seem to have no impact, but having it demoralize the people in China who are trying to build a better China. And I would say having a president of China visit the United States and be treated with such respect and not being confronted even, I'm not sure privately or publicly, with some of the many what I could consider to be evil things that are going on, would have a dramatic impact in the long run, in that good people will be demoralized and then not move to make China a better place. So there can be a negative impact without anybody even seeing it. I was very honored to have led the floor fight with Congressman Chris Cox at the time, opposing most favored nation status for China. And I remember the only reason they made that permanent was when I think it was Bill Clinton, over a holiday, decided to declare it a permanent state where they didn't have to come back every year and put most favored nation status before us. Because when they had to come every year, at least there was some pressure that was on them through that year to correct their behavior, to correct bad behavior. We eliminated that, and we eliminated that with the promise that if we liberalized and I say liberalization is not just economics, but that's what we were saying, a liberalized economic relationship with China would lead to a much freer and and it would lead to progress in many other areas. That was about 25 years ago now, and maybe let me ask the panel as a whole: has there been we were promised we'd have things like an independent court system would emerge. Is there an independent court system that is a fair court system has emerged now in China in the last 25 years? Has that happened? No. Is there anyone saying
no.
yes to that? Okay, no one is saying yes to that. We were told there would be opposition parties that would be permitted. Are there opposition parties now functioning in China to take the place of the ruling Communist Party? Anybody in the panel know
Nope.
about? No. Okay, what about, we were told that there'd be greater freedom of press and freedom of speech if we just had greater economic relationships. Is there greater freedom of speech and press now in China as compared to before Tiananmen Square?
Can I answer that?
Yes.
There, I think the answer is much more mixed. There is not a fully independent media that has the rights to ask any question on any issue and write about it without fear. But there is a more active media, particularly on economic issues and economic issues that touch upon civil society questions, that is more active, and the boundaries on which they can report has expanded some. And the growth of social media, Chinese versions of Twitter, you see much more discussion, but it is still highly constrained. And it's
Mr. Chen testified to several incidences of people who are losing their property and corrupt officials. Not necessarily these corrupt officials are being brought to justice, but that they're doing these corrupt acts. Are those corrupt acts, can they be printed in the paper when a government official, not being arrested, but just a newsman thinking that there's corruption there, we should investigate it? Is that possible for a newspaper to publish that in China? Mr. Chen?
好，我想说呢，在中国，只要中共专制政权存在一天，就不可能有任何的司法独立和其他的所谓独立。
I must say this, that as long as the communist regime remain in power, there will be no such a kind of thing as independent judicial system or independent court.
所以这个呢，王岐山在访问这个斯坦福大学的时候，曾经明确的回答过，就是这个不可能。
But as Mr. Wang Qishan, the Chinese Communist Party chief of disciplinary inspection commission of the Communist Party, told the visiting Stanford scholar Francis Fukuyama that no such a thing is possible as independent court in China. Never.
所以在中国呢，我们要清楚地认识到，共产党是一个专制政权。专制政权的本性就是反民主、反法治、反自由的。那么这是由他的本性决定的，他不可能放弃他的专权。
Yeah. Anything that we talk about China is on the fact that the authoritarian regime is by itself, by its nature, against freedom and democracy.
刚才谈到关于中国的经济，实际上长期以来呢，中共是在这个整个每年7%也好，8%也好，这都是造假。实际上就是用农村的一个书记都知道，今年的经济是多少，你告诉我，我就知道明年的经济是多少。这个就是在今年的基础上，只要加一个数就可以了，这个没有跟实际的经济完全没有关系的。
As for the economy that we talk about, the Chinese GDP numbers, has everybody know it's fabricated, and even my village chief would know that for the next year, GDP growth objective would be something at one number above the one that we have this year.
那么
It's nothing to do with the real economy.
所以中共呢，我觉得现在的经济崩溃，这是一个历史的必然啊，因为中共本身对这个政治体制能够持续下去已经不抱什么信心了，他们现在在拼命的把钱都转出来。那么中国的股市，这个证监会本来是管理股市、监督股市的，那么实际上证监会的构成人员就是这些投资的，就是这些大企业的上市公司。你想自己管理自己、自己监督自己，这跟中共的政权一样，它能不崩溃吗？
Well, as you can see, that Chinese economic collapse is inevitable as its regime, because this group of people who supervise or regulate the stock market are themselves investors and brokers, right, with those power brokers in a state-owned enterprises. How could that prevent collapse of the Chinese economy?
Okay, one last question I've got to jump in here, and that is that the Chinese president promised or indicated when he was here that it wasn't government that is doing this hacking and spying into our system. Does any one of our witnesses believe that? No. Let me suggest that when we are dealing with such a regime, that we shouldn't be playing these games. And if we have to deal with it because it's in our national security interest or whatever, as we did during the Cold War, maybe we should just be upfront about it. But if we aren't, it will demoralize the people in China. If they think that the people who will reform that system in China, our greatest allies are the Chinese people. And if we demoralize them by them thinking that we believe this garbage, we've done a great disservice to future Chinese and future Americans as well. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. For the record, I'd like to claim that I am not 1 hour late for this hearing. I am 1 hour early. That is to say, we were scheduled at 2 p.m. This is not the fault of our esteemed chairman by any means. You had to reschedule rather suddenly because of a important Republican conference. Mr. Chair, it's my understanding that you won't be in a position to control the timing of the Republican conference until you're elected speaker, which we eagerly await. I yield to the gentleman.
Don't hold your breath on that one.
It could happen. I'm running too. Mr. Chen, thanks for being with us. Your story is inspirational. This has been a big week for Asia, a big week for U.S.-China relations, and a huge week of victories for the Chinese government. The most notable part is something they didn't have to lift a finger to do, and that was this trade agreement. You say, how is China affected? It is affected by the rules of origin provisions, so that goods that are made perhaps 65% in China, 35% in Vietnam, have free access to the U.S. market. Now, we don't know what the percentage is for various types of goods. We know for auto parts, but nothing else. The legislators of the government of Brunei, they know. Chinese intelligence knows. We don't know. We look forward to being treated with at least as much dignity as the legislators in Brunei or Vietnam. But until then, we can only look at prior agreements where we would expect that goods would only have to be 35% made in one of the 12 contracting parties, so they could be 65% made in China. But that's de jure. Then there's de facto. By the way, this is kind of my opening statement, and I'm going to ask questions. So I'll go a little bit long. I was told I could make an opening statement, but I want to throw in a question. I'll ask our witnesses, would the Chinese government cooperate in making sure that goods that were 85% made in China and 65% made in Vietnam are not mislabeled to be 35% made in Vietnam and only 65% made in China? Should we expect any cooperation from the Chinese government in enforcing the rules of origin provisions? Dr. Kennedy? I think this is a one-word answer.
Actually, yes.
You're saying the Chinese government would rat out a Chinese-based company because goods were 80% made in China and 20% made in Vietnam, but they claimed to U.S. authorities that it wasn't just 20% made in Vietnam, it was 35% made in Vietnam. Yeah. You're saying the Chinese government would rat out that company?
I think it would be hard for them to, over a long period of time, maintain that fiction, since the Vietnamese government is going to have a different interest with them and others.
Oh, no, the Vietnamese government will say, here's an opportunity to export goods to the United States, a highly competitive market, in the most efficient way possible. And if the goods can be produced most efficiently at the highest quality, 85% made in China, 15% made in Vietnam, why would Vietnam want to crush that export, that company, that product, in order to see goods made in Mexico take their place on American shelves? In any case, I'll ask any of our witnesses, are you aware of any occasion where the Chinese government has come forward and disclosed to American authorities that a Chinese company, not run by a dissident, was in violation of U.S. law? Got a lot of knowledge about China here. Can anybody come up with an example? I don't see Dr. Kennedy raising his hand. I don't see the next witness Mr. Baitlick raising his hand, not Dr. Weiss, and not Mr. Chen.
The only example that I could think of off the top of my head would have been to the extent in 2013 and 14 when the Chinese government was focused on anti-corruption or unfair competition practices in their healthcare sector and others, and they would have let the U.S. Department of Justice know about potential violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
So that was attacking a U.S. company and depriving American workers and American companies of access to the Chinese market. You have illustrated my point. They will reveal that information only when it is in the interest of mercantilist objectives of Beijing. So we have one huge benefit, and that is China gets free access to our market. And of course, there's nothing in this agreement that gives us access to Chinese markets because China isn't even a signatory. But the other big win here was we were told that this deal would be a chance for the United States to establish that it is American trade rules that will govern the Pacific. Well, to a good extent, Wall Street's rules are going to govern the Pacific. But there's one departure, and that is currency manipulation. This agreement sanctifies the view that countries are free to manipulate their currency and to have all the benefits of free trade agreements. And I don't think that's a victory for American trade objectives. That's a victory for Chinese trade objectives. But I want to go on to the media, and here's where I may have some expertise given my home district. The day is gone when Hollywood is going to make a movie about Tibet. As a matter of fact, I don't know if Richard Gere will get many parts in the future at all. We now have a situation where, whether it is Mars or anywhere else, there has to be a pro-Chinese government hero message in the movie in order to be made in Hollywood. Not only do the Chinese control their own market, but a Chinese company controls, I believe it's AMC anyway, the second largest bit of screens in the United States. So if any of you, I hate to break this to you, Mr. Chen, you will not be the lead character in any major movie made in Hollywood. Either yourself nor will you be played by a famous actor, because that movie will not be shown on a big chunk of American screens, and the Chinese only let 35 movies made in America into their country. So all of Hollywood is desperate to be one of those 35, and the only way to be sure that you're going to be one of those 35 is to make sure that the Chinese government or its agencies and activities are one of the heroes of your movie, whether it is Mars or anywhere else. So those who think the Chinese government only controls China don't understand how interconnected the world is. We have an expert in human rights in China. Mr. Chen, what can we do to expand human rights in China?
我觉得对，刚才我在证词后边已经提到，就说我们美国如果现在比如说国会，我们现在就立法禁止这个中共这些人权迫害者入境美国，那么就能够大大的降低他们对本国人民人权捍卫者的迫害程度。
As I recommended in my statement, testimony, that if Congress make laws to deny the entrance of those human rights violators in the communist regime, that will help defend human rights in China.
另外就是这个网络自由，我们如果美国就是把现在国会的拨款能够有用的比例大一点，去开发这种突破网络封锁的软件，或者我们集中力量去推翻中共对这个网络的封锁，这个网络柏林墙，那么这对中国人民获取信息，对中国人民思想意识的觉醒，那也是起着非常重要的作用。
Another thing is about freedom of internet. As I said, that if Congress budget a little bit more assistance to develop the cyber software to break down the firewall of China, which will provide the information definitely needed for the Chinese people, which will promote press freedom and democracy there. That will be a great contribution.
那么现在呢，有一个趋势就是中共知道这个非常重要，所以说他花了很大的力气在国际上来试图让国际在这方面投资少一点，比如说自由的媒体，比如说，但是现在呢有很多短波都被停掉了，我觉得这是一个错误的决定，这恰恰是中共想要的。
And actually, the Chinese regime know this very well, and they try to stop people invest in developing such a kind of software. And as a matter of fact, that I observed that some of the shortwave radios has stopped broadcasting, which is a mistake. That's just what the communist regime need.
Thank you.
If I can,
Gentleman's time's expired.
It is more than expired.
Yeah. But we're going to vote in just a minute, but I did have one follow-up question because it's such a pressing issue with Mr. Baitlick. This agreement that our two presidents made regarding cyber hacking, what are the ramifications or implications if China doesn't agree? Was there anything really tangible that can act as a deterrence for this happening? And what would be the likely outcome if something does occur? And then the second thing is, with the People's Liberation Army not being involved in any of this agreement? Does China just have the ability to kind of do this now and blame them, or not even blame them, but say our government's not involved, like you said in your opening statement? And is there a way for us to continue to push forward to say, wait a minute, we're asking that you make sure that the Army doesn't do any of this hacking as well? And anyway, what are the best ways for us to move in that direction?
Thank you for the question, sir. The last consequence that we appear to have available is sanctions. The President mentioned that in the event the Chinese don't appear to be upholding their end of this agreement, that the administration would pursue activities possibly through U.S. trade rep or through the WTO or through some mechanism. The executive order that they signed earlier this year gives them the authority to impose sanctions as well. My personal opinion is we're not going to see sanctions anywhere within, say, a 6-month period. And honestly, that starts to get towards the end of the Obama administration, and he may simply say, I'm going to hold off just for the rest of my time. As far as the issue with the PLA, it's entirely possible that the Chinese government could, rather than direct the PLA or the MSS to conduct these operations, they could sort of take a Thomas Becket approach and say, wouldn't it be great if someone could get us this information? Or there is a need, the government has a need for this sort of information, and the military might pursue it on their own, or you may see a movement of people from those units into the Chinese private sector, where suddenly they become security companies and contractors who carry out this activity. We've called that the decentralized scenario at FireEye. Honestly, until the Chinese government changes its strategic decision to pursue Western technology and to abandon any sort of vulnerability or dependence on Western technology, they're going to continue to get this by any means necessary.
So it sounds like to me, it's kind of everybody is on their own. Everybody would be advised to beef up your security as much as you possibly can, because in the near future, there probably isn't going to be any real significant government action to make sure that it doesn't keep happening.
Yes, we are not worried about not being busy for the next many years in our industry. And by the way, sir, there's nothing about this that is exclusively Chinese either. You could easily see a country like Nigeria or some other country say, we're going to adopt a similar model.
Or Iran, or any number of countries, as you mentioned.
Yes.
Mr. Sherman, I'm going to give you one more question, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up.
Thank you. China has a program against corruption. I think this is maybe just aimed at the opponents of whoever, President Xi. The United States has the capacity to identify assets owned by princelings and their children and relatives outside of China, and otherwise to paint a beautiful, clear, and embarrassing picture of unwarranted wealth of those in power. If we had this information and leaked it to various press organs, would that outrage the Chinese people at the party? And which publications would have both the courage to publish and the credibility with the Chinese people? I'll go to any witness who wants to answer.
OK， 我想对于中共首先哪些中共干部参与了迫害人权，我们很容易的现在通过中国的网民来确定他究竟做了什么。第二，他的资产是。
As for those human rights violators of the communist regime, that we can tell who they are and what they did through the internet users in China who expose their violations.
另外呢，像他们在中国国内，如果按照他们正常的说法，就是说他们的收入，那么计算，那很容易知道他总共有多少财产。那么 他家里倘有巨资，或者这巨资转到海外，那么很容易鉴别这些钱，那就是来自于不正当的。
Well, we can tell by the normal calculation of the monthly salary or year salary of those communist regime officials, and so we know that any number beyond that should be regarded as ill-gotten wealth, which is quite easy to recover, I think.
就像中共中央的一些官员家里有几百亿甚至上千亿，我想他全家人的工资加起来也不会有这么高。
And as you can tell that by the already reported wealth of those individual top Chinese officials whose household wealth could be amount to tens of thousands of multi-millions of US dollars actually, and I can't imagine how could that possible based on their basic income as an official in China.
如果有了这样一个系统，那么关于中国有些问题，其实我们可以想办法解决。我相信这些都能解决。
If we had this system of exposure in place, I think that we could find solutions to those issues in relating the two countries.
谢谢。
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been a very wonderful discussion. There's so much more to say and so many more things to learn. The goal is to improve the bilateral relationship. It's not just to cast aspersions, but to build that relationship. But we do have some very big concerns. Mr. Sherman has raised several and has in the past about currency manipulation issues and unfair trade practices. Mr. Chun, we're very honored that you would take the time to be here today. You have developed such a wonderful global reputation for fighting for freedom and for human rights, and we appreciate. But all of our distinguished panelists have been extremely good, and we appreciate you being here today, and this committee will be adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate you being here. Thank you.
At the CSA.